Amateur College astronomer Dr. Salman Hameed, Mr. Universe, here at your kitchen table in Amherst for some more kitchen table astronomy. And right down the street from where you live in Amherst, at UMass Amherst, there was some fun local connection to some pretty big astronomy news.
Yeah, it was pretty cool, if you remember, Monte, and we've talked on in another radio station, but that was the big news about an image to a certain degree, and again, I'm using air quotes in there, image of the shadow of a black hole.
Because you can't take a picture of a black hole because no light can escape from it. You can only take pictures of light. We saw in 2017 a ring. I turned it into my Facebook profile picture. I thought it was so cool. What was that ring of fire?
And that was around a galaxy that is about 55 million light years away. Its name is M87. It's exciting for astronomers, okay?
Sounds cool, yeah.
and so that was the first time that we saw light in some ways that is right next to where the event horizon of the black hole starts. And in some ways you are seeing the shadow of that black hole because light, which we are not seeing, is where the black hole is. And
because it's so dense, light cannot escape from it. It's amazing. It's an amazing thing that Einstein theorized about, but then also himself believed probably didn't exist, but now has been proven 100 years later that it does.
A spectacular confirmation of that. And the UMass connection comes in because the way it was done was using a network of telescopes, which is called Event Horizon Telescope, which includes one of the telescopes, large millimeter telescope, which is part of UMass, or UMass is sort of like,
and that one's in Mexico?
It is in Mexico. It is a collaboration between UNAM, an institute in Mexico, and the astronomy department here at UMass. So that's pretty cool.
Oh, yeah.
And so this was in 2017, and now results have come out for 2018. And it used 7 telescopes in 2017, and then another telescope was added in 2018, which is called Greenland telescope. And basically, what this network of telescopes do is to turn the whole Earth as a giant telescope.
Amazing.
And that is, I think really cool. You have, I mean, the details of these observations are insane because you have to figure out the right conditions, and of course the observations are not exactly at the same time, and depends upon, as the Earth is rotating, you have to figure out exactly how you are going to combine those. It requires amazing amount of computational powers and so on and so forth. And so it was very cool result. And just now another paper has come out when they did an observation again in 2018, and they looked at the same image of the black hole or the event horizon again. And first of all, cool, the first image was correct too, because they found the same thing in 2018. So that's always a good thing.
If it was missing in 2018, that would have been a problem.
Or it looked completely different. You go like, maybe there's something wrong with the telescope. So no, they got the same thing, which that's what you would expect. But one of the principal investigators here from UMass is Gopal Narayanan, and as he described it as well, I mean, that's sort of like, good to know that it's a similar thing is there. But to me, what's really cool about it, they mention in the paper that has come out that there is a bright spot that they found sort of like in the material around the black hole that has moved. The bright spot has moved about 30 degrees between the observations in 2017 and 2018, and which of course, like, then we have to say that, which actually was sort of like, supported by the theoretical predictions, and we understand why this might have happened, and of course it rules out some models and so on and so forth. But to me, the cool thing is, okay, here from the Earth, we use the Earth as a giant telescope, and then we looked at the center of a galaxy, M87. That galaxy is 55 million light years away. It has this central massive black hole. Almost all galaxies have these giant black holes in our center. Milky Way has it too. Its image was also taken, but it's a much smaller one. This is a giant black hole. Its size is beyond the orbit of Pluto, you can think about. And for black holes, you go like, it's big. But you are looking at that size, 55 million light years away. And then you can go like, oh, by the way, in 1 year, there was some material that moved from one place to another. And again, so sometimes you think about, well, in astronomy, all the timescales are so huge, nothing changes. Well, no, things do change. And this is a change that we observed 55 million light years away.
Yeah, it actually happened in our time 55 million years ago. Every time you look at a star, you are looking backwards in time. So when you say it's 55 million light years away, it means the light has just arrived here now. We are seeing something that happened, a movie from 55 million years ago.
That's right, and 55 million years plus 1 year, and it made a little bit change, and we observed it.
That's pretty cool.
So that's actually really cool. So congratulations to UMass astronomers. Congratulations to Gopal Narayanan. I mean, this is actually really amazing of what humans can do. And I'm going to come back to my pet peeve about these type of things. When we think about doing positive things, when we think about curiosity, when we are not thinking about militarization or money or other things, I think that's really cool.
While you were doing some research, you were YouTube bombed by an advertisement for Space Force. They wanted you to join the U.S. military's newest branch, Space Force.
That's the reason why it was on my mind, because I was just watching sort of like some actually an astronomy channel, and then this ad came in that looked actually kind of cool. It was like about looking up at the stars, looking at sort of that I want to really shape the future. And I was like, wow, this actually sounds cool. But I was like, but who is advertising it? And then at the end, join Space Force.
Did you join?
I cannot disclose this because I may have joined the secret part of it. but it is one of those things, and I want to plug in as related to that. I want to plug in an excellent podcast that I've been listening to that was made in 2019. That was the 50th anniversary of Apollo landing. It is called Moonrise, and this is by journalist Lillian Cunningham, who had done other podcasts called Presidential and Constitutional. So she's interested in American history in that sense. And this is about, as you would imagine, it's about like in the Apollo program. But what's fascinating about it is that she focuses on why we ended up going to the moon rather than how we did it. So it's not about the technical aspects. It is more about what were the reasons that were shaping the race to the moon. And that history is interesting because, again, as she says right in the first episode, that most of this documentaries start with JFK's speech about going to the moon. But actually, that is not the case. And you have to go back to science fiction authors. She talked about how they were bringing in this element of this imagination, but also the missile program, the nuclear programs. Those were deeply tied to that. Werner von Braun was the father of, in some sense, rocketry, who has the problematic past because he was a Nazi in some sense, or working with the Nazis to bring in the V-2 rockets. He was brought into the US. And so there are a lot of complicated histories to that. He also was after Sputnik, he was also author of a plan to actually militarize the moon, as we were talking about Space Force. But because he was working for the military at that time, and one of the ideas was that, you actually send American military personnel on the moon. This is late 1950s, and take that over so that then we can shoot missiles from the moon. We have the high ground.
Oh, wow.
And there were these quotations, and that's where some of the science fiction also meets, because there was this quotation that whoever, and this is probably from Dune in some sense, although Dune came a little bit later, but whoever controls the space controls the earth. And those statements were made by military personnel as well, borrowed from science fiction talking about it, especially Robert Heinlein, whose famous Starship Troopers, connects to that. So there is this interesting history, and so do check it out.
And this podcast is called again Moonrise?
Moonrise, and two other things that I want to mention. Hey, why not? One is my own. And no, I wasn't alive at the time of Sputnik, but the perception that comes in about this thing, that when people heard about, especially in the US, that Sputnik had been launched, there was widespread fear. And people were like, oh my goodness, there's a red star that is going around, and so on and so forth. That is actually not the case. In fact, most Americans actually were fine with that, and they were like, oh, there's a progress of science. And Eisenhower, who was the president, he actually didn't think it was a big deal. But it was the media that really made a big deal out of that, about the sensational aspect of that. And Lyndon Johnson, who was a Democrat at the time, and he thought that this is a good political thing, and he actually launched an investigation about where is American response to Sputnik? Why is the US behind? Because people actually knew that satellites are going to be launched. In fact, US and the Soviet Union at the time were also thinking about, well, maybe have a sort of like, as part of the International Geophysical Year, maybe launch it together, so on and so forth. So it wasn't the kind of narrative that comes in. And and I also learned that Margaret Mead, the famed anthropologist, she actually did interviews at that time with Americans on how do they think about Sputnik, and it turns out they were fine. So again, this is sort of like how history gets rewritten afterwards, and to me that was wonderful, and also that after Kennedy's speech, and I'm not giving too much away because this has already happened.
Yeah.
but like after Kennedy's speech, he had so many sort of like reservations about committing like Americans to go to the moon. And in fact, in his speech itself, in which he made the announcement, there were a lot of qualifiers that, okay, if we are going to do it, Congress must approve this thing, but if we must decide, are we going to do it or not? And after the speech, he was like, oh my goodness, like, he was unsure whether that was a good idea or not. And he, in fact, proposed to Khrushchev soon after, why don't we just do a joint mission? We don't have to have a space race to the moon. So again, this notion that, and he brought it up twice, like because he thought that JFK thought that he had committed too much, and whether he wasn't sure if they would be able to do that or not, and he thought that maybe instead of that, maybe we should have a joint mission to the moon. And I was just thinking, just imagine, and again, for the Soviets, there was no incentive to say yes to the joint mission because they were ahead at that time, in some sense, propaganda value. I mean, not in terms of other things, but certainly they were getting a lot of publicity. But I just think about, just imagine at that time if Khrushchev would have said, yeah, sure. And if there would have been a joint American-Soviet mission to the moon, I mean, how our history of the planet, and I'm making this big pronouncement, but that may have been how we think about space would have changed. And so anyway, so yeah, do check it out. It's I love this podcast.
I'm going to start listening to it right after I leave your house. Moonrise, not Moonrise Kingdom, but you should check that out too.
Great film too.
Wes Anderson. One more thing, there was some big news about the moon just last week because Japan became the most recent nation to soft land a vehicle on the moon, despite what may happen with that particular lander now.
Yeah, so this is so last week there was also a failure because there was an American company that sent, which was the Astrobotic peregrine rocket, which we talked about before because it had human remains and that had become sort of like ashes and that had become controversial and things like that.
Had Gene Roddenberry, a bunch of other Star Trek people on there.
So their remains are now in Earth's atmosphere. Well, because it didn't make it to the moon, but it came back and crashed burnt up through the Earth's atmosphere over South Pacific. So, it's still cool.
Got to space.
Yeah, it got to space. It did travel for about 500 million miles or so, before coming back and crashing into Earth. And that again just is a reminder that it is hard to get to the moon, and Japan became only the 5th country. So after the US, Russia, China, India recently, and now it's Japan, which had its spacecraft called SLIM, Smart Lander for Investigating Moon. For kudos to the name.
Yeah, cool.
And they landed on there, and the goal of this mission was to demonstrate precision landing. It's very hard, and you can imagine if you are there, there are boulders, there are craters, and in fact, the famous Apollo 11 landing, Neil Armstrong had to actually take over manual control because they thought they're going to crash and so on and so forth. So it is a very hard thing, and that's the reason it's hard to land on the moon. So this was trying to show that the cameras on board the spacecraft and radar that is bouncing off light to see how high it is, that it can combine those two things together to land on the moon about within the radius of the size of a football field. And it managed. We don't know exactly how accurate it was. They said that it's going to take a few weeks to months to figure out whether it landed exactly in that same place or not. But the place that it was going, it was not on the South Pole where a lot of interest is of the moon, but it was an area near a crater which was a little bit slanted. They knew that it was slanted. But it looks like that the way the lander landed, that its solar panels are pointing in the wrong direction. And so it's right now running on battery, but they think it's going to run out soon. But it also has two rovers, a Lunar Excursion Vehicle 1 and Lunar Excursion Vehicle 2. And one of them is a hopper. It's kind of cool, sort of like, it actually hops around. And the other one is a small, tiny, you can say whatever vehicle it is, but it's like size of a baseball. And
it's like BB-8 from Star Wars.
And that's what's happening now, because you can have these CubeSats, these really small, you can have electronics in those tiny things, and they can do a lot. And that's what's making it easier now, because then you can launch a number of these things. So it is there. And so Japan has joined in this club. And next month, there's expected also Intuitive Machines of Houston. We actually talked about it, that it also contains a mission to an asteroid, which is being kept secret where it is going. But that is expected next month. China's mission to get samples from the far side of the moon. Sample return mission. Never been done. Remember, China is the only country that has landed on the far side of the moon successfully. Again, the problem is, far side you don't see, and so in order to communicate, it just makes it harder. So China is the only country so far to have successfully landed on the far side of the moon, and now their next mission is to actually get samples from the far side and bring them back to Earth. That mission is expected later this year as well.
Lots of action on the moon.
It's amazing in that sense. Do not put military on the moon, do not put missiles on the moon, and do not make it a big casino.